For the last few months, I have been recording and uploading a playthrough of Pokemon X with the goal of properly exploring the Kalos region again ahead of Pokemon Legends ZA. Instead of zooming through the game like I normally might, I've stopped to talk to NPCs, sit on benches, look at waterfalls, go to restaurants and cafes, and so on. You get the idea. This is the last part in the series, and it was not in my plans at all when I started. Even when I got the idea to make this video, I thought that it would be a quick, simple, off-the-cuff kind of thing. But now it's ballooned to the point where this is actually my first time writing a script for this channel. The idea is to wrap up my thoughts on X and Y, and tie up any loose ends from the things that I talked about during my playthrough. So, if you've just clicked on this one video, and any of my thoughts here seem kind of shallow or disjointed, it might be worthwhile to go watch the playthrough and see how I cooked them up in the first place. And, as a bonus, you can watch a very strong fairy type, and it's not the one you're thinking of, run through a bunch of the Kalos region's trainer battles. And I'm looking forward to talking this through, because as I think is obvious by now if you've watched the playthrough, my opinion on Pokemon X and Y has changed some since I started this series. I didn't expect that, and it's been an interesting experience for sure. We'll get to that. But anyway, let's start with a question that seems simple at first. Just how good are Pokemon X and Y? Are X and Y among the very best games in the entire Pokemon series? No, I don't think they are. I like them, but I never fell in love like I did with some of the earlier games. To me, these have always been solid B-tier Pokemon games, no more, no less. But one thing I've learned as a Pokemon fan is that it's very hard to rank Pokemon games in a fair way. Because when I've made tier lists and the like in the past, it's been impossible not to notice how my own experiences of the games and the stage that I'm at in life when a given game comes out have influenced my opinions. Of course, this kind of thing is always subjective, in that people have different tastes. But I'm talking about subjective experiences. There's a strong correlation between the stage of life that I'm in when I play a game and my opinion of the game, and I think that's true for a lot of fans, whether they know it or not. And here's what I'm talking about with that. I say often that my favorite Pokemon generations are 2 and 3. I'm sure I've said it on the channel before. I don't think it's a coincidence that those are the ones that I played as a kid. I also played Gen 1 as a kid, but only after I'd already played Gen 2. So, I like Gen 1 a lot, but it isn't quite the same. Gens 4 and 5 came out when I was a teen, and I was kind of feeling that extra angst about the world and urge to be critical of the games, and questioning how much longer I would play Pokemon at all. Funny that that was a question at the time. So I didn't experience those games quite as fondly as the earlier ones, or the later ones. Gen 6 and beyond are the games of my adult life. They don't blow my mind like the games of my childhood did, but I don't have any reason to be hypercritical, and at this point, I can just relax and enjoy them for what they are. When I've made Pokemon game tier lists before, I've had X and Y, Sun and Moon, Sword and Shield, all grouped together as solid B-tier Pokemon games. Not amazing to me, like the early gens, because I'm not a child anymore, and I just can't experience the fantasy in the same way that I did. That experience, like the instances of beauty that Lysander wanted to make eternal in the story of Pokemon X and Y, is gone forever, and it's all the more special to look back on because of that. But the recent games are still good, I still enjoy them. They're a fun time. And I rank Scarlet and Violet higher, among my very favorites, partly because of the bold steps forward that they took for the series, but definitely also because I happened to change the way that I play the games in this generation. I go to VGC events now, and I compete in person as part of a broader community. I made this channel in the Scarlet and Violet. So again, it's hard to separate the games from my subjective experiences associated with them, and that makes them hard to rank against each other in anything that could be considered an objective way. As for X and Y, those experiences have now changed a bit. I called these B-tier games a moment ago, but, like I've said earlier in the series, I absolutely do like these games more now than I did before I started recording these videos. Genuinely, this playthrough specifically has done a lot to make me fall in love with them in that way that perhaps I didn't before. Maybe I should move them up to A tier, but I'm just not sure I have it in me. We'll talk it through. And if you're watching this and X and Y are your very favorite Pokemon games, maybe or maybe not because they're the games of your childhood, that's awesome, I love that. I love to hear about why any particular game is someone's favorite. And if I'm right about how people choose their favorites, X and Y might be due to have a moment like Gen 5 has been having lately. I was online when Black and White came out, and then Black 2 and White 2, and I remember those games each being heavily criticized by the community at the time. Now I'm always hearing that Black 2 and White 2 are peak. And I don't think those games... Sorry, misread the script there. I do think those games have aged well. I appreciate them more now than I did then, but I also think it's partly because the kids who grew up on those games have, well, grown up now, and become more prominent voices in the community. I love to see that, and it would be great to see X and Y have their time too. And if Game Freak have timed it just right, maybe Legends ZA will be able to ride that wave. That's not to say that there are no objective differences in quality between Pokemon games. Of course there are. And I don't know whether X and Y will ever be celebrated quite like Black 2 and White 2 are now. But I like the games, and I'm sure they're someone's favorite, and I hope they get their moment, whatever it looks like. So let's dive into these games a little more closely, starting with the story and themes. The story is fairly standard Pokemon for its time. Get badges, fight bad guys, beat your rival, but there are some interesting ideas layered on. First of all, pretty much every Pokemon game has the theme of coming together. It's a big part of what the whole series is about. People trading, competing, sharing an adventure together. And X and Y tap into that partly through the player character's friends. All 5 children go off on their own adventures with their own goals and priorities, but regularly gather to make memories together and connect through battle. Professor Sycamore encourages this every step of the way. Lysander is a villain in large part because he is stuck on a rigid idea of who he is and how to interact with the world and can't bring himself to come together with others in the same kind of way. And through the conflict with Team Flare, we see how different people coming together can solve problems that look too big and too scary for any one of them. Worth noting again, by the way, that these were the first main series Pokemon games to release worldwide on the same day, instead of months apart in different regions. Even the advertising for these games played on the idea of an interconnected world, as did some of the new Pokemon designs. Notably, Vivillon, having different patterns in different regions, encouraged people to form trading networks all over the world. Beauty is another major theme of these games, and not only because Lysander can't stop talking about it. Much of the Kalos region is pretty to look at. They do some decent things with perspective in areas like that route before Snowbell City, you know, the one with the bridge, where you battle a few of the friends. Or the river area with the Battle Chateau. There are pretty caves, like Glittering Cave, Reflection Cave, and even the Frost Cavern. Other interesting routes like the snowy one with the Mamoswine and the creepy route before Laver City. I complained a lot about the Badlands, which I find annoying to traverse every time, but it's a cool route to look at. There are interesting views throughout the region. Sometimes you can sit on a bench and get a nice look at a fountain or a waterfall. I haven't talked about Parfum Palace in a while, and the game definitely has some jokes about how extravagant it is and its rich owner, but I do always find it kind of stunning to look at when I get to that part of the playthrough. And there are lots of spots in Lumiose City where you can just stop and admire a pretty street with an obelisk and the Prism Tower in the background or something. And the region's beauty is expressed through its characters and Pokemon too. I sometimes kind of clumsily compared the region to a garden, and not just because there are literal colorful flowers everywhere, with different wild encounters in them, but because the region seems dynamic in a way. Things are always growing and changing, things are being built and rebuilt, characters go on journeys and are changed by those journeys in different ways, and things decline as well, such as the cycle of the world. And there's a beauty in that whole broad, region-sized picture. Not to mention there are some striking and colorful Pokemon designs, and designs like Furfrou and, again, Vivillon, where the varied appearance is the point. But what Lysander in particular can't understand is that this beauty is dynamic. No part of it stays the same forever. Just like Xerneas and Yveltal exist in a cycle of giving and taking, the beauty of the Kalos region is always growing in some ways and declining in others. The picture stays beautiful in one way or another, but it never stays the same. Nothing is eternal except maybe AZ and his Floette. Diantha calls that out in her conversation with Lysander early on, and he refuses to see it. And AZ lives thousands of years of regret because of what he did out of grief when something precious to him died. Beginnings and ends come up a lot in this generation, and they fit into the cycle of dynamic beauty. With Zygarde as the legendary Pokemon Z, associated with endings, and implied to bring endings itself when the cycle is disrupted, I don't doubt that Legends ZA will pick that theme up and do something with it. What little we've seen so far suggests that Lumiose City will be going through changes in that game and building to something new and special. Who knows what Zygarde's part in it will be, or what other forces will be involved. And again, the region is also dynamic in that it is filled with different kinds of people who have different goals and values, but can come together in friendship or to solve problems. While life can be chaotic and destruction is always part of the cycle, the game tells us that we can build a better future by finding common ground. I was critical of some parts of this message, like how late the emphasis on it seemed to come up, and especially that dialogue from Serena where she talks about compromise with Lysander. She presents it as if we represented opposite extremes and needed to meet in the middle, when Lysander's position was that he wanted to kill everyone except Team Flare, and we wanted him to not do that. I don't think we were extreme in that. But I guess if Lysander were capable of compromise, it would be a very different story in the first place. And the basic idea of different people combining our talents and resources to achieve a common goal together is a solid message. This being a Pokemon game, there's also an emphasis at times on people connecting through battle. Shauna, Tierno, and Trevor all battle the player and Serena at times to experience part of what our journeys are about, and those battles seem to strengthen the bonds between the characters. Trevor finds that he enjoys battling the player and has feelings about battle that he didn't know he had. And Serena keeps to herself more than the others, sometimes skipping experiences like the scary house, and seems to connect best with people by putting her all into a battle after some extended training. So battle is the way to meet her where she is, and her bonds with the other characters get stronger each time she battles them, especially the player. I guess it's time to talk about the region, though I've started to already. Kalos is pretty, and has its share of interesting environments, for sure. And while I wouldn't make a point of doing this in every playthrough, it, of course, is better if you go around and talk to the NPCs throughout the region. For one thing, people sleep on how funny Pokemon games are sometimes. A lot of NPCs in this playthrough that I might normally have ignored said things that made me chuckle. And that kind of thing happens a lot in this series. It's an underrated strength of Pokemon. It's definitely present here. And there are other NPCs dropping bits of lore that will be important later, or references to other parts of the Pokemon world. It's fun. And Kalos has a fun culture on top of that, with interesting art in some areas, weird and goofy cafes and restaurants all over, spots like the Scary House and the Inverse Battle House. Characters sometimes say over-the-top things about love or their jobs. I poked a lot of fun at the work culture that we saw in some episodes, and at NPCs pulling a weird amount of passion out of nowhere. You get the idea. There's a lot of that kind of flavor in the Kalos region, and it makes it a more dynamic and interesting environment. One area where I think the design of this region does suffer a bit, and this has been an issue through a few of the 3DS and Switch games, is a noticeable disconnect between how vast the region looks and what we actually experience of it. There are a number of areas where the perspective lets us see well beyond where the game will actually let us go, and the solution was just to stick a forest there. It's an okay solution, I guess, but I'm left wondering why I don't get to explore any of those deep forests, and am stuck on a very developed path full of buildings and people. And probably the worst offender is the power plant, where we get to go inside one small portion of what looks like a much larger complex. A lot of people assumed that if they had made a Z version, we would have seen more. But I'm not convinced that those other buildings were ever actually going to be anything more than pretty background scenery that would get our attention, but then never do anything with it. I've been bothered for years by what I call a lack of wilderness in Kalos, and that has continued to be a trend in other regions. In the very early generations, there were remote areas you could explore where there would be no other human characters around. Not many, but some. And these areas were often associated with legendary Pokemon, those being some of the rarest Pokemon in the region, so it makes sense that they would be found in an area like that. Think of locations like the Seafoam Islands in Gen 1, the Whirl Islands in Gen 2, the high parts of Mount Coronet in Gen 4. Nothing around but the player, wild Pokemon, and an unspoiled natural environment. Legendary Pokemon sometimes feel more special when you have to go looking for them in areas where no one usually goes. You could even include the abandoned power plant in Gen 1, which of course is man-made, but has become kind of a wilderness area. Kalos is notably missing something like that, and later regions have tended to miss it as well. The closest thing in Kalos is probably Terminus Cave, but even that is full of trainers. The vibe that they seem to have gone for is an area that has only very recently been explored, where they have dug up something ancient and mysterious in Zygarde. But to me it ends up feeling like just another route to an extent. Or like Reflection Cave, which is a cave, sure, but one that people often wander through as they go from place to place. And maybe I've harped on this too much, but I think it might have made a difference if we had seen where Team Flare found Xerneas, or in Y version, Yveltal. The trailers showed Xerneas alone in a vast forest, and Yveltal is said to roost somewhere in the mountains, but we don't get an area like Xerneas' forest in the actual games. Or rather, there are a few such areas, but they're really just inaccessible background. I do know that the trailer isn't the gameplay, but it stood out to me that Xerneas was so often shown in a setting that doesn't resemble anywhere we go in the actual game. Not even Santaloon Forest looks like that. we encounter the Box Legendary and Team Flare's underground base in the middle of a town, and we never see what kind of remote area it was in before. And to me, that kind of makes it hard to place Xerneas and Yveltal as super rare creatures that fit in somewhere in the environment of the Kalos region. Even something like a Team Flare grunt in Victory Road saying, "This is where we dug out that tree," would have helped. But what I really want is even just one remote wilderness area, and I do think it's a knock on the region design that we don't get that. Anyway, I guess we should talk about Lumiose City, since that's kind of the central hub of the region, and apparently the setting of Legends ZA. It's a fun place. I'm a player who can kind of get overwhelmed by a large area like that, and lose the will to explore, but even in this playthrough, I wouldn't be shocked if you felt sometimes like I was just going through the motions in some parts of Lumiose City, because I had to do that to keep up the premise of the series. But Game Freak understood that Lumiose was their largest and most ambitious city yet, and I think they did a few smart things with it. First, as much as I made fun of the whole blackout thing, massive portions of the city being fully inaccessible, it does kind of make Lumiose City more manageable in that it's explored in different stages. Since it's the central hub of the region, the story makes you pass through it a few times, and it's easy to end up visiting more often as you go. Only a small part being accessible at first makes it less of a task to explore, while building up interest in seeing the rest of the city. Second, the Looker Bureau storyline is very much structured to make you explore the city at least a little. By integrating places like the Art Gallery and Hotel Riches Me into the story, the game shows off some interesting side locations to players who might otherwise have missed them. Using the alleys at some points encourages players to explore off the beaten path a little, and just setting the whole story inside the city is a good use of a location and maybe a sign of what's to come next year. Finally, Lumiose City genuinely just has a bunch of fun, silly, and interesting flavor. The weird trainer battles in the alleys, the goofy restaurants that I had so much fun with in this series, things like the PR video studio and the Battle Institute, which I never really bothered with before now, a whole bunch of cafes with their own little quirky characters and themes, making it feel like the city is populated by so many different subcultures and hobby groups and different categories of people that have found community in these spaces. Characters who are weirdly passionate about whatever, have a weird idea of work-life balance, like I mentioned earlier. Weird details like the ghost girl, the person listening to the elevator, and that guy whose proudest achievement in life is making it harder to open a door. Seriously, what is in that room? Oh, and you can ride a goat around the boulevards. That's very important. And the ceremony after you become champion is a nice touch too. The point is that Lumiose City is packed with details that are easy to miss in a fast playthrough, but make it hold up pretty well as a vibrant city unlike any that a Pokemon game has had before, or I would say since. All of those little details combine to make it something special in the franchise, and it can be pretty to look at too as you're wandering around. I'm going to quickly segue here to some other optional details of this game, which I didn't even think to put in the original outline of my script, but they, I guess, kind of flow from there being a lot of optional details to check out in Lumiose City, and those are some of the features that you can use from the bottom screen. I never really used Pokemon ME except to evolve Eevee into Sylveon, and I didn't get an Eevee in this playthrough, so I never thought a single time to use it, but I certainly like the idea of a space to interact with your Pokemon in that kind of way, feed them and groom them and the like, and I'm glad that they kept some version of it in later games. What I did use much more often, back when this was the current generation, were Super Training and Wonder Trades. Wonder Trading is decent fun, and I definitely miss Super Training today. Anyway, not a lot else to say about those. They're nice. One more thing about the Kalos region before we move on, and that is its treatment of past generations. Modern Pokemon games are sometimes criticized for what people call quote-unquote Kanto pandering, which is basically playing on the nostalgia of older fans through callbacks to the original games, whether that's reusing a map layout or a story beat, or giving a new form to Charizard yet again. Some people are annoyed by Kanto pandering, but I'm not. I actually think it's good. Maybe that's not surprising, since I am one of those older fans, but I hope I've made it clear by now that I'm not some hardcore Gen 1er who can't accept anything released after the early 2000s. But Pokemon is a game that has both a rich history and a need to generate a lot of new content every few years. I think it's good for a new generation to show some love to what came before it, to tie a new game into the history of the franchise in a very strong, concrete way. and to celebrate the Pokemon that people already know and love. It's part of how the series appeals to such a large and varied fan base. They give Charizard a spotlight yet again, and maybe you cringe, but someone out there loves it, and the new content of the new generation is also there to enjoy just as much. I think I said that when I went to catch Mewtwo in the playthrough that I was glad it got to Mega Evolve, because I was told in the 90s that it was the most powerful Pokemon in the world, and it had been badly losing credibility in that regard in recent generations. Mewtwo should get a buff now and then, so that fans like me don't have our childhood dreams crushed. It's probably due for one now. That said, I think that X and Y do get a little weird at times in the callbacks to old games. I have no problem with the free Kanto starter, the Gen 1 legendary encounters, or the free Lapras. But it definitely is weird that Santaloon Forest is laid out like Viridian Forest, and that having to get a Pokeflute to wake up a Snorlax is a thing again. The game does at least place the Snorlax and Lapras relatively early on, so they're kind of distant memories in the later parts of the story, but while I think that Kanto pandering is a good thing overall, these games are an early instance of it being a thing in the first place, and there's definitely some awkwardness in how it's implemented that they get better at avoiding in later games. Also, does anyone else kind of wonder what was going on with the treatment of Generation 5 in these games? Professor Sycamore's office is full of pictures of Gen 5 Pokemon, Parfum Palace has those Reshiram and Zekrom statues in the garden, and NPCs in the Looker storyline use a bunch of Gen 5 Pokemon. Maybe that last point can be explained by the fact that this is the very next generation after number 5, and Gen 5 has the most Pokemon in it, even more than Gen 1. So of course they'll pop up a lot when we're not used to that yet, and it will feel like there's something going on. But I don't know about the lab pictures or the statues. I guess it's not unusual for Pokemon games to feature some callbacks to the most recent generation, but those ones stand out to me for whatever reason. Not that there's anything wrong with them, I'm not criticizing, I just kind of wonder what they were cooking there. Of course, one reason for the old Pokemon to get so much attention is that there are relatively few new Pokemon in X and Y. It's now common for a new generation to have fewer than 100 new Pokemon, but I think this was the first one that did, and it was a huge drop right after the largest generation by a new Pokemon count. And it's made all the more noticeable by what was, by the standards of the time, a massive regional Pokedex. The Kalos Dex isn't so unusual now, but the sheer variety of Pokemon was a novel thing when these games came out, and made the relatively small number of new ones all the more noticeable. That said, I've always felt like Game Freak went with quality over quantity in Gen 6, and they made the right call by doing that. I'm no Gen 5 hater, but some of the Pokemon designs in that generation don't quite do it for me. There are very few Pokemon designs in any generation that I flat out dislike, but Gen 5 maybe has a few, and there are plenty more that I think are kind of awkward. By contrast, I don't think Game Freak missed much in Gen 6. There are a lot of very cool Pokemon designs in this relatively small group, and there are very few duds. One group that I wouldn't call a miss, but I do think is not their best work, is the starter trio. And I'm obviously in the minority here to an extent, as far as I know, Greninja is massively popular. They certainly market Greninja like it's massively popular, and I'm sure that doesn't come from nowhere. And I think I've mentioned before, by now, I'm personally not such a Greninja fan. It's a mostly cool Pokemon, but the detail that I focused on most when I first saw it was that its scarf is its tongue, and I really didn't like that. I'm more used to it now, but I still think it's not great. It's just a really awkward feature. Imagine what happens to that poor tongue when Greninja gets caught up in a tough battle. So I don't love Greninja. It's certainly not my least favorite starter, but a mostly cool design with one massive flaw just works out to be as, it's fine, it's okay. It's an okay Pokemon design. And in the end, I think all three fully evolved Kalos starters are just that. They're fine. Delphox is my favorite of the three, but it's kind of an odd-looking creature too, and not in an especially cool way. Chestnut is okay, but Quilladin has always struck me as maybe the least inspired middle stage for a starter. All three basic forms are cute, but once they're fully evolved, they're just okay. I do like that they all have second types. After so many years with the same three starter types, I honestly do find it boring when starters don't get second types by the time they're fully evolved. I like that Game Freak did something with the fighting, psychic, dark type triangle that fans had speculated about for years. I like the classic RPG flavor of the combat, magic, stealth triangle in their designs. But the designs themselves are, well, like I said, I don't love or hate them. They're fine. But there isn't anything here that I would ever be likely to choose from an all-time list of starters. On the other hand, I do absolutely love the Gen 6 legendary Pokemon. One small criticism up front, I don't know that the quality over quantity concept holds up so well with the legendaries specifically. It did kind of make sense for the time, because Gens 4 and 5 were packed with relatively minor legendaries, the likes of Heatran and, I don't know, Terrakion and them. And I think that legendary fatigue was setting in for a number of fans by the time X and Y came out. But looking back now, it's kind of a shame that Xerneas, Yveltal, and Zygarde are the only Gen 6 legendaries, and there isn't even a simple duo or trio of lesser ones. It might be nice if Legends ZA adds some new legendaries. Not a lot, but some. And since Legends Arceus added one, it definitely could happen. But that's it for the criticism here, because with the 3 legendaries that they did make for X and Y, they knocked all 3 designs out of the park. Xerneas is bold and colorful, and the X shape of its legs and antlers evokes a creature that can firmly ground itself and just emanate powerful life energy to everything around it. It's an amazing Pokemon to show off the only new type since Gen 2. Yveltal maybe gets the short end of the stick design-wise, if only by comparison, but it doesn't really matter because I love it just about as much. It looks kind of scary and dangerous, like it could appear in the sky at any time and drain all the energy you have in you. And Zygarde works well as an inscrutable serpent hidden deep in the earth. We never saw its other forms in Gen 6, so I don't know whether I should talk about them here, but it certainly delivers on that unleashing mysterious power part of its lore, and I'm looking forward to it finally getting its due in Legends ZA. I don't love the major legendary designs of Gens 4 and 5. Dialga and Palkia are maybe trying to do too much for me, and Reshiram and Zekrom are, to me, just okay. Again, that's all my opinion. But to me, Xerneas and Yveltal, and also Zygarde to a lesser extent, were a clear return to form. I rank them right up there with childhood favorite legendaries like Kyogre and Ho-Oh, and as you know, that's pretty high praise for modern Pokemon designs from an old school fan. Those important categories aside, the Gen 6 Pokemon are, for the most part, just a good bunch of Pokemon designs. Diancie is one of my favorite mythical Pokemon, and is another stunning example of what the new fairy type could be. Hoopa is cool, and kind of an odd one. Volcanion is honestly a little bit of a sore spot for me, because it's one of only 2 Pokemon that I don't have in the game, since the stores in my area didn't do the distributions. Not thrilled about that, but it's a pretty solid mythical Pokemon design. Adding Sylveon to Eevee's list of career options was a nice touch, especially when they revealed it before the fairy type and had us all guessing what type it could be. A lot of people guessed correctly, but I found it so hard to believe that they would add a new type that late that I was just stuck on it being a flying type until the official reveal, because I couldn't think of a better idea that wasn't a new type. But whether you called it or not, it sure generated a lot of hype when they revealed it that way. Tyrantrum and Aurorus are some of the most interesting fossil Pokemon in the series. Talonflame is one of the cooler early game birds. Vivillon is pretty, and its different patterns have been great for online trading and for things like new Pokemon Snap. I'm not much of a Diggersby fan, but I'm sure someone is. And then the rest of the Pokemon list is just packed with awesome, fun, and quirky Pokemon that don't fit any special category. Pokemon like Go-Goat, Pyroar, Clawitzer, Hawlucha, Aegislash, Noivern, and Klefki. Like I said, they didn't miss much in this generation. Actually, going back to Diggersby, one other thing I'll praise about Generation 6 is how much personality some of the new Pokemon show in their designs. Diggersby is a good example, but my favorites are Pancham and Pangoro. They're fairly simple designs, but their facial expressions and poses say a lot about what kind of creatures they are. I didn't think much of Pancham at first, and I put one on my team in my first playthrough just because it was a new Pokemon that I had found. But I kept it on my team the whole way, unevolved, because I didn't yet know how to evolve it. And by the time I beat the league, I had a crystal clear mental image of my Pancham as a scrappy underdog that took on bigger Pokemon and didn't back down. That imagined personality flowed so naturally from its design, and I loved it. It's an excellent example of how you can bond emotionally with these silly little digital monsters in your video game, and its design just made that happen so easily, so naturally. Then of course, there's the Pokemon franchise's first super transformation mechanic, Mega Evolution. It was shocking when they revealed it, as we weren't used to what we now call generational gimmicks. I'm a Mega Evolution fan for sure. Seeing so many different Pokemon transform into these super-powered forms adds a layer to their designs beyond what Pokemon is normally willing to do. I think there are some interview quotes out there, don't ask me for sources, where Game Freak staff have talked about the balance that they try to strike in Pokemon designs, including not focusing too much on making them look cool. Mega Evolution shifts that balance and lets us see familiar Pokemon in a new light. It lets them go crazy with cool and over-the-top designs in a way that doesn't fit their normal design philosophy, and I love it. Until recently, I would have said without hesitation that Mega Evolution is my favorite super mechanic in the series so far. Z moves never interested me much because they transform a move instead of a Pokemon, and that's just not as exciting. Dynamax was fun to play with, at least I thought so. I know not everyone agrees, but I enjoyed playing with Dynamax, but it's also visually boring. Terastal is the only one so far that I think can compete with Mega Evolution, and I'm not sure I would have said that a year ago before I'd had more time to get used to it. Of course, the main weakness of Mega Evolution as a mechanic is that it's very hard to scale to every Pokemon. Since Mega Evolved forms are individually designed for each species, it would be a tall task to make one for every Pokemon that exists. And since it's said in the games to take the Pokemon quote-unquote beyond evolution, it makes sense that they only ever made Mega forms for fully evolved Pokemon. Unevolved Pokemon just don't get access to them. The individual designs are part of the charm of the mechanic for sure, but it does have the unfortunate effect that many people's favorite Pokemon get left out, because they just can't design that many of them. Dynamax doesn't have that problem, and neither does Terastal, and that's why I think Terastal is probably now the best super mechanic. It's an interesting battle mechanic, it introduces new layers of strategy in the selection of Terra types, it easily scales to every Pokemon, and it does that while still being visually striking. It's hard for Mega Evolution to compete with that. But Terastal is the polished crystal version of a super mechanic, and Mega Evolution is the early prototype. And without a doubt, Mega Evolution's unique iteration on Pokemon designs and power boost to some classic Pokemon have a special place in my heart. I'm looking forward to seeing it return next year. And one other strength of Mega Evolution is that, being this raw early example of a super mechanic, it has a kind of timelessness to it that later iterations don't. There are little nuggets of lore that connect Mega Evolution to Xerneas or Yveltal, but its origins are never properly explained in X and Y. Then it shows up in Hoenn with a new, possible but still unconfirmed origin story. Most super mechanics now are closely tied to their regions, probably so they could be easily left behind in later games, and the legendary Pokemon in those regions. Z Power Rings are made from Necrozma's body. Dynamax bands are made from Eternatus' body, and they only work in certain spots infused with its power, and Terastal orbs use crystals from Terapagos, though we do see that the crystals can be taken to other regions. Since Mega Evolution has vague origins and just needs a Keystone and a Megastone, it's no big deal when it shows up in Alola or Kanto in Generation 7. It's easy to use in spin-off games and other media. It could easily be brought back if they ever want. It's the only super mechanic to coexist with another one in the same games, in, of course, Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which have both Mega Evolution and Z moves. Like with the new Pokemon designs, I don't think Game Freak missed much with the Mega designs. One detail that I like is the way that they sometimes seem to work design notes from an earlier evolutionary stage into the design of the final one. Mega Tyranitar has a shape to its body that makes me think of Pupitar, and Mega Aggron has armor that reminds me of Lairon. It's a nice touch. Otherwise, I think most Mega designs succeed by doing one of two things. Either exaggerating the cool features that the Pokemon already has, in examples like Gallade, Manectric, and Metagross, or putting a fun twist on the established design, like Pinsir using wings, Slowbro being mostly consumed by its shell, or Sableye popping a giant gemstone out of its chest and then hiding behind it. One of my favorites is Mega Diancie, which kind of combines both approaches by ramping up Diancie's beautiful crystal body design, while also flipping its stat distribution on its head and completely changing how it plays in battle. There are only a handful of Mega forms that I don't really like, and there are two main examples that I can point to that are kind of opposite sides of the same coin. One of them is Mega Heracross. Mega Evolving changes a lot about poor Heracross. Heracross's main feature is its horn, which it uses to throw things. Mega Heracross has a new horn design that isn't optimized for throwing things anymore. Instead, its body and its battling style are built for multi-hit moves, mainly projectiles like Pin Missile and Rock Blast. Its whole body shape is very different from before, even though it's still a big blue beetle. And while I've praised designs like Mega Pinsir and Mega Slowbro for putting a new twist on the base Pokemon's design, I don't know, maybe you could say that Mega Heracross went too far. I look at Mega Pinsir and I see a Pinsir with a twist, but I look at Mega Heracross and I don't feel like I'm looking at a Heracross. It feels like a whole different Pokemon, and to me that's always made it stand out in a bad way compared to other Mega forms. And while it's not in X and Y, it came out in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, I'm not really a fan of Mega Salamence for pretty much the opposite reason. While I look at Mega Heracross and don't feel like I'm looking at a Heracross, I look at Mega Salamence and feel like I'm just looking at an ordinary Salamence. When its art came out, I had a hard time spotting the differences compared to most Mega forms. It works better in the in-game model for sure, and I know logically that it is clearly distinct, because as soon as I saw Roaring Moon in Gen 9, I knew that it was based on Mega Salamence specifically. But even so, while Mega Heracross feels too different to me, Mega Salamence has never quite felt different enough. Again, those are opposite reasons to not like those two so much, but I guess they're kind of two sides of the same coin in that I just didn't think that Game Freak quite got the balance of a Mega Evolution design right with either one of them, in different ways for each. There are a couple of other Mega Form designs that I don't love. Sceptile, for its gimmick of turning its back to the opponent, I've never been very into that. And Lopunny, because it's Lopunny. Mega Evolution was just never fixing that one. But that's about it for the criticism. I really do think they nailed most Mega Evolution designs, and when they kept the mechanic around in Gen 7, I was disappointed that we didn't get any new ones. But they were learning to move on to the next thing, I guess, and they committed hard to moving on after that generation. But I hope that we'll see some new Mega Forms in Legends ZA. As I wrap up talking about new Pokemon and forms, you might have noticed that I haven't said anything about the competitive side of things. And that's largely because I just don't have much to say about that. I barely played competitive Pokemon in Gen 6. I wasn't interested in VGC yet, and while I did still play OU at the early end of X and Y, I didn't really stick with it any longer than that. The last time I played OU any significant amount, I was using a hazard stacking defense form Deoxys team in X and Y. It was fun, but for context, that's how early it was. That's how long ago it's been. How early it was in the generation that I played OU. That hadn't been banned yet by the time I dropped off. So I don't have much knowledge or really any takes on competitive X and Y. But even if I did, I'm a Pokemon fan before I'm a competitive player. And while I have a lot of fun with VGC these days, I'm always going to judge a set of Pokemon on their designs and lore first and foremost. I don't know how X and Y hold up competitively. Okay, I've heard the complaints about Xerneas and VGC. I wasn't playing back then. But Game Freak mostly nailed it on the design and lore side of the Kalos Pokedex, and in the end, that's what I care about more. And now, with the Pokemon out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the human characters in X and Y. And let's start with the people who were with us from the start of the journey, the player characters' friends. This group gets a lot of flack from the fan base, and I think it's partly justified, but not completely. These are certainly not the most deep or interesting characters in the series, but they're better than people often say. As a side note, I'm going to call them friends instead of rivals, because Shauna and Tierno aren't really rivals in any significant sense. Serena, or Callum if you're playing as Serena, is the only traditional rival of the bunch, while I'd say that Trevor kind of counts as a Pokedex rival, though I don't actually know whether it's ever possible to lose to him in that. As I've mentioned before, X and Y have a theme of people with different outlooks on life coming together and forming connections. Come to think of it, that's a great theme to pair with the largest and most vibrant city in the franchise, as Lumiose City has people doing that on a relatively large scale. But anyway, we're talking about characters now, not the locations. The friends fit into this theme in a way that makes a lot of sense for their role in the story. Like in any main series Pokemon game, the player character is a young kid setting out on a journey, and so are their friends and rivals. So, with this group, Game Freak had each of them go on a different kind of journey, and it's easy to read them as each representing a different way of playing the game. Serena is a competitive player, connecting with others through battle and trying to be the best. Trevor wants to complete the Pokedex. Tierno is doing a themed playthrough, I guess. He has a specific theme to the team that he wants to put together. And Shauna doesn't have such a concrete goal, but is just on an adventure, making memories and learning about herself along the way. All 4 of them represent valid ways to engage with the games, and each approach has some real-life players who prefer it. It's a nice touch, especially when you battle all of them late in the story, and it's clear that some of them are stepping into your world because they want to form that connection with you. But it does also result in some relatively shallow characters, especially Tierno and Trevor. Trevor battling you before Snowbell City is a nice character moment, but unless I missed something, it's not really building on or leading to much of anything. Tierno is the same goofy dancing guy throughout. I don't think that these characters have to be especially deep. They're kind of given lesser attention in the story than Serena and Shauna anyway, but I can definitely see why so many fans consider them one-note and kind of boring. On the other hand, I do think those criticisms miss the mark with Shauna. Shauna's more aimless and free-spirited in her approach to her journey, and that makes it hard to give her a typical Pokemon character development, but she has an arc and some fun interactions along the way. Shauna is the clearest example of how different people can come together to solve a shared problem, as she goes from vaguely hearing about the Team Flare storyline while she's busy wandering around having fun, to jumping in and helping even though she doubts her own ability. She knows that her battling skills aren't on par with the player or Serena, so she contributes in ways that suit her skills, cleverly distracting guards at a couple of points, and opening the door to the legendary Pokemon thanks to her love of puzzles. I guess you could say that on some level it's an early, less refined version of the self-discovery and confidence-building arc that a character like Hau or Hop gets in later games, but it still works for me. And Shauna is also a fun character in her interactions with others, like the ways that she calls out the Parfum Palace owner and that guy in that scary house. She makes me laugh sometimes, and that's always nice. And then finally there's Serena, or again, Callum, but it was Serena in the playthrough that I just did. Serena is an interesting character for a couple of reasons. First, I like that she's a rival who battles the player character relatively late for the first time. Shauna and Tierno fill the gap early on, while Serena is set up as a threat because she's the most experienced of the group. When the first proper rival battle arrives in the Tower of Mastery over who will get the Mega Ring, it's a nice dramatic moment with unusual stakes for a first rival battle. And yes, I know that you can just try again if you lose, but you kind of have to work with the fantasy of a Pokemon game. That's just how it goes. And second, Serena's interaction with the broader group of friends is a nice touch on the theme of different people coming together. She's the loner of the group, and often not there for group events, like the Scary House, but she's a friend just as much as the others. The other characters are maybe sometimes disappointed that she isn't around, but they understand and accept that she has a different way of doing things, and that involves training hard so she can show up and connect with people through battle. It's nice to see the friend group acknowledge their differences and have that kind of bond, and you can be sure that Serena will show up when it matters most. Of course, the one Serena moment that I really didn't like, I mentioned before, it's a little bit of dialogue where she suggests that we should have met Lysander in the middle. It's clear what they were going for thematically, but oof, that sure was a misfire, at least in English. We've covered the friends, so now let's look at the villains. And let's start with the big man himself, because I think Lysander is pretty clearly the character that I most changed my mind about during this playthrough, and I ended up kind of fascinated with his character to the point where I was rambling about him across multiple videos. At some point in the middle of recording this series, I watched a video essay that criticized Lysander for having no identity as a villain, but I think that criticism is wrong, and I think a lot of players, including me for a long time, have missed the mark in how we look at Lysander's character. There's an old trope about kings, where they're actually burdened by the pressure of ruling, feeling endlessly responsible for the strength, safety, prosperity, and overall well-being of the kingdom, and the people in it, and struggling to handle that heavy burden. Whatever you think about royalty in 2024, it's a real trope. And it says a lot about how Lysander sees himself. He isn't a king, of course, but he sees himself as a special figure in a similar way. It helps that he's descended from royalty, but he also sees himself as an elite figure because he's a successful tech entrepreneur, was a major philanthropist before the whole Team Flare thing, and has built up a lot of clout in the region. It's clear that he sees the world in terms of winners and losers, the haves and the have-nots, the worthy and the unworthy, and he sees himself as one of the worthy because of his wealth, power, heritage, and clarity of vision. And that means it falls to him to solve what he thinks are Kalos' problems, because who else can be expected to step up? Lysander is an elitist who sees being elite as a burden. He's a dark take on that trope about kings, someone who imposed that pressure on himself and then cracked under it, and it's all rooted in how he perceives himself and his place in the region. This is made clearest in the notes that are easy to not ever find in a playthrough, in that one room in in Lysander's lab, which draw a comparison between Lysander and AZ. AZ, we're told, brought great technology and prosperity to Kalos, took leadership of the region, and saw it thrive. But when events took a dark turn, and it was too much for him to bear, he built the ultimate weapon and did terrible things to end the crisis at hand. The parallels to how Lysander perceives himself are clear. He thinks of himself like a king, he brought impressive new technology to the region, he hasn't created the peace and prosperity that he wanted, and now he turns to the ultimate weapon out of, desperation, sorrow, anger, probably all of the above, I think. Lysander is mocked for being an obvious villain from the get-go, and it is kind of hard to believe that characters like Professor Sycamore didn't at least kind of see this coming, but I don't think it's quite the silly fumble by Game Freak that a lot of us thought it was, so much as it's an intentional writing choice. Lysander is very stuck on his particular way of looking at the world and his place in it. He can't reconsider, he can't compromise, and that inflexibility is fundamental to his character. So of course, it comes out early, and often, even if the early game supervillain rants are admittedly pretty weird. And again, it fits into the themes of the story. Lysander isn't interested in connecting with people who have other views. He just thinks that they're wrong and need to get out of his way. And in the end, he's defeated by a team-up of several different characters with varied skills, interests, and worldviews. In the end, Lysander is a tragic villain. It's pretty clear that there's no good ending for him, and the fundamental reason is his central flaw, that he refuses to budge from his rigid way of thinking about the region and its interests. He follows AZ's example, but just blows right past the part where using the ultimate weapon caused AZ to live thousands of years of bitter regret. And of course, Lysander's ultimate goal is impossible, freezing what he sees as the beauty of the Kalos region in eternity, cutting off the dynamic, chaotic change that really is part of its beauty, isn't something that can ever actually be done. Things always change. Lysander knows that killing all Pokemon will make him sad, but still decides to try to do it in service of that impossible goal, and I think we can understand that even if his plans succeeded, he could never be happy. We never meet the philanthropist Lysander who bonded with Professor Sycamore in the first place. Even when we first meet him, he's already doing the supervillain rants, but the tragedy still comes across if you look at it critically, and you read his various notes. His worldview can be jarring to take in, but the picture comes together in the end, and he's not exactly subtle about his tragic flaw. Honestly, for a Pokemon villain, Lysander has some surprising depth. I kinda think that maybe a lot of us missed that, including me, partly because we just didn't expect it from a Pokemon game. And, also those notes are easy to miss. Then there's the rest of Team Flare. They're a bunch of goofballs, and I've always loved them for it, even if their flashy designs and fashion talk are hard to square with Lysander's super serious genocide thing. Apart from Lysander, they're maybe the silliest evil team in the series, and while it might not be the greatest choice for this story, I do enjoy it every time, and I'm not very motivated to criticize it. They're fun. And one other thing I'll say after this playthrough is that Team Flare's whole fashion thing does kind of have an interesting place in the broader character of the region. Kalos is a place of beauty, flashiness, and passion, but even so, the Team Flare suits and boisterous talk stick out like a sore thumb, and other characters sometimes comment on how tacky they are. But of course, Team Flare themselves keep telling us, like that one grunt said in the Frost Cavern, that their outfits are the very definition of fashionable. Maybe I'm reaching here, and I kind of feel right now like I'm back in high school English class trying to do literary analysis without really understanding the author's mind. But it kind of feels like Team Flare are an over-the-top riff on their leader's elitism, and how it clashes with the rest of the region. Like, they're trying to be the best at embodying the overall vibe of Kalos, and they think they're succeeding, but really they don't even understand it. One last thing about Team Flare, and while I'm not eager to do this, this is the part where I touch on real-world politics just a tiny bit. Like I said earlier, Lysander sees human society as being divided into the worthy and the unworthy, with Team Flare being the worthy, and therefore the only people he plans to spare from his genocide. What makes them worthy in his eyes isn't touched on much, and again, I might accidentally step out of what Game Freak actually intended to imply, but I think we can kind of read between the lines here. Obviously, Team Flare are the people who are willing to follow Lysander and dedicate their efforts to his vision. That surely is at least part of it. But otherwise, they're not exactly a very impressive group. They're a bunch of goofballs, and they're not especially competent. There's nothing that obviously qualifies them to be seen as uniquely worthy by Lysander, except their loyalty to him, and one other thing. You see, it costs money to join Team Flare. We're told a few times that there's a buy-in, and as I recall, it's not cheap. The grunts don't have a whole lot going for them, but they do have money. Lysander's idea of which people are worthy correlates strongly with wealth. In fact, I'm not sure the loyalty even matters without the money, since people don't get to join Team Flare and be spared in the genocide unless they pay up. So let's just say that Lysander ended up reminding me a bit of real-world people whose political views equate material wealth with a person's overall worth. And I think we can leave it there. You know what I mean. And it's appropriate that it's the villains in this game who think that way. It's not a good way to look at the world, nor is fighting so hard to cling to whatever you think is beautiful and right at a particular moment, instead of accepting that the world always changes and there's always new beauty to be found in it. I think there are some real-world lessons there. But okay, back to talking about a children's video game. What other characters are there to cover? AZ is a good one, but I've already basically covered what he's about. The emotional reunion with his Floette is one of the most touching moments yet in any Pokemon game. Shame they programmed a special, unique Floette into the game and then never released it to players, huh? But I guess it would be hard to square with the lore. I don't think I have much to say about Professor Sycamore. I probably missed something in his character. I feel like I must have, but he just seems like a standard Pokemon professor with a couple of twists that set up the themes of the games. A little extra passion, some extra kids that get Pokedexes from him, and that note from his past in Kuraway Town about the uncertainty of what kind of person he might grow into. I'm not sure I have any more insight on him than that. Oh, what about the player's mom being a Rhyhorn racer? I don't know, I don't think I have a take on that either. It sets up ride Pokemon, I guess. You do ride a Rhyhorn at one point. But I guess that leaves the gym leaders and the Pokemon League overall. The gym leaders in this game are fine, if not generally the most interesting in the series. I think Game Freak had figured out by this point that gym leaders, and other characters like them, like trial captains in Sun and Moon, are a bit more interesting when we get to interact with them outside of the gyms as well. But there isn't a lot of that in X and Y. With the obvious exception of Karina, most of the gym leaders really only exist in their gyms and the optional Battle Chateau rematches that I just didn't do. They do have some interesting designs. All of them show some personality, at least in their gyms, and some are more memorable than others. Viola saying fantastic over and over seems to be burned into my memory. Karina gets to be an actual character in the story beyond running her gym. She's fun to run into here and there. Valerie is memorable as the first fairy-type gym leader, and going to the Pokemon Village to find Wulfric is a nice touch, though Wulfric's actual gym battle is a letdown, because there's just no plausible way that his team is strong enough for that moment. I'm sorry, Wulfric. It's just underwhelming every time. The start of Pokemon's 3D era did make for some interesting gym puzzles that I enjoy. They're not the most challenging or anything in this game, but it's fun to watch a Pokemon protagonist do some rock climbing or swing from ropes. All of the gyms look fun and interesting except Clement's, which sadly is a bit of a dud, I think, and if you're like me and you want to battle all the gym trainers, definitely a bit too tedious. That's kind of a shame for it being the one at the center of Lumiose City, but on the flip side, my favorite of this game is Olympia's gym. It's barely a puzzle at all, but the small simple room that blasts the walls away and turns into a weird cosmic gravity-bending path is something I never get tired of looking at. It's just good fun, every time, in every playthrough. The Elite Four is also kind of a case of cool environment, underwhelming characters. Malva is the only one we see outside the Pokemon League. Her connection to Team Flare and overall personality are definitely fun, and she has the most personality of the Elite Four by far. The others all have something to their designs, but as characters they're kind of just there. But their rooms do look nice, if absurdly dangerous, and hey, that's nothing new in Pokemon. And then finally there's Diantha. I don't know, she's one of the less engaged champions in the story, though she does pop up sometimes. I guess she's a bit of a foil for Lysander in that she's also part of the elite of the Kalos region, but she rejects his views and accepts that she can't control the region or maintain her place in it forever. But I really don't, and she doesn't take on the self-imposed responsibility that Lysander does that's too much for him or anyone else, but I don't know that there's much more to her than that. The champion is a famous actress, okay, sure. In jumping to the 3DS, doing the first simultaneous worldwide release in the series, and introducing the first super mechanic with Mega Evolution, X and Y felt like the start of a new era for Pokemon. I still think of them now as kind of the first quote-unquote modern Pokemon games, with everything before them being the classic games. And while Game Freak has continued to iterate on the Pokemon formula in newer games, X and Y feel like they were still playing it relatively safe. These games stick more closely to the classic formula than the ones that came after them, and it's fair to say that the formula was showing its age by this point. And that does come across especially in the gym leaders and the Pokemon League in X and Y. I actually think Game Freak is in a tougher position than some fans acknowledge when it comes to innovating in the Pokemon series. Maybe that's because I'm old enough to have played the classic games when they were new, and I remember how fans back in the day, think like Generations 3 and 4, would get upset if they thought that Game Freak was about to make major changes. I remember old forum threads where people would complain about the possibility of a new game not having a top-down perspective like the Game Boy ones did, because that would ruin the formula, or so people said at the time. There was, or at least there seemed to be, less appetite for change back then, and I don't really blame Game Freak if they were a little slow to pick up on that appetite shifting over time. But of course, X and Y came out several years and several game releases after, say, Diamond and Pearl. We've seen more and more of the same, and it was starting to underwhelm. I don't generally feel this way as strongly as a lot of fans. I kind of don't mind if Pokemon does the same thing over and over. I know that I like it, but I still wasn't immune to this feeling when X and Y came out, and I bring it up in the context of the Pokemon League because in the 6th generation of Pokemon games, people just weren't interested in the characters of Elite Four members who only show up for that one battle at the League anymore. It was hard to be interested in gym leaders who just sat in the gyms and waited forever. We'd seen that many times before, and the slightly different personality here and there didn't change much about their role in the story, or who they were from our perspective. And I think Game Freak understood that, because Sun and Moon do a much better job at integrating a large cast of characters into the story and making you feel like they really live in this world and you can get to know them. Generations 8 and 9 have their own twists on the Pokemon League formula that keep things somewhat fresh as well. X and Y are the point at which the old formula stuck around unchanged just a little too long, and it's a fair criticism of these games, even if I think it's understandable that that kind of thing happened in the series at some point. Okay, almost done here. Let's talk about the post-game. It's not a bad one. Just trying to run through it for the video in this playthrough, I found that there was a fair bit to do, but it's not without some flaws. When people think about a post-game in Pokemon, they often think about a battle facility, you know, the Battle Tower, and all of its variants in different games. That's the clearest example of endless replayability in Pokemon on a single save file. Catching Zapdos or exploring Kilude City is something you really only do once, but a battle facility can be challenged as many times as you want without restarting your game. And I do think the Battle Maison is underwhelming and is a weakness of these games, though admittedly I never got very into it, and it's possible that I've missed something, but I wouldn't know, because I was never interested enough to find out. Like many fans, I don't know why they never did another Battle Frontier after Generation 4. To me, the original Battle Frontier in Emerald is as good as battle facilities have ever gotten, with its 7 different facilities that mostly have weird twists on their battle formats. Okay, sure, the Battle Palace is bad, I never liked that one, but I had a lot of fun with the others, even without optimized teams. And the Gen 4 Battle Frontier was pretty decent too. The Battle Maison, like many others around its time, is just bland by comparison. Even its leaders lack the personality of the Frontier Brains. I've never found it interesting at all unless I'm in the mood to play some triple or rotation battles. It does at least have those, and I don't know why they went with that approach. So that is my main criticism of the post-game. I know it's a common criticism, and I think it's a very fair one. But that aside, we did find a decent amount to do, even just in this playthrough. Legendary Pokemon, Megastone hunts, more restaurants, facilities like the Battle Institute and Battle Chateau. It's not exactly endless content, but it's a decent amount and it's fun. And then of course there's the crown jewel of the X and Y post-game, the Looker Bureau storyline. I haven't talked much about this storyline yet because, well, I was saving it for the post-game section, but if you want to examine the characters of Pokemon X and Y, Looker and Emma are two of the best. Looker is at his most charming and kind-hearted and generous in this game, and is a great role model for Emma, even as his undercover mission forces him to be dishonest with her at times. And Emma works very well as a character who grew up on the streets, lost in the crowds of Lumiose City, She's smart and capable, knows the city like the back of her hand, has picked up some skills along the way, but is also kind of naive and confused at times among more sophisticated characters with very different backstories from hers. It's a fun dynamic and a fun storyline that forces you to explore Lumiose City a little more deeply than you might otherwise do. I even enjoyed the role of that weird Team Flare scientist whose name I don't know how to pronounce, who forms a genuine bond with Emma and Looker by the time the story is over. Talk about different characters coming together and building connections. Depending on the time period for Legends ZA, I wonder whether we'll get an Emma ancestor, descendant, or even Emma herself. I think there's a lot of potential there. Oh, and I don't know whether this is even intentional, but I love how Looker's attitude toward the Lumiose gang, and to some extent toward Emma, just kind of casually dunks on Lysander's whole flawed philosophy. Looker doesn't see them as unworthy losers. He sees them as decent but flawed people with the capacity to, as he puts it, mega evolve into productive members of society. And it works out very well, as they end up helping Emma run the detective agency when the storyline is over. Looker knows far better than Lysander how to change Kalos for the better. He makes it look easy and obvious. It doesn't even seem like he's put all that much thought into it, but he's just a good dude doing his part, and it's compelling in a way that Lysander's supervillain nonsense never is. All those details that I enjoyed, and while these games are probably someone's favorites, it's fair to say that they aren't among the most popular in the series. So what went wrong? Off the top of my head, I have 5 main ideas about that, and one of them is the aging formula that I already talked about for a while. As long as Game Freak kept the formula of Pokemon games fairly rigid, there was always going to be a point where it wore out its welcome with a chunk of the fanbase, and it makes sense that it seemed to kind of happen here at the start of a new Pokemon era with games that didn't innovate as much as the ones that have come after them. Second, I think a lot of us, including me, were kind of played by our own expectations for these games. Lysander, here I go talking about him again, has some real complexity as a villain, but he comes across as a simple and cartoonish one at first, in a series where, up to this point, we had been conditioned to expect that kind of villain, with the one notable exception of N in Black and White, and he's not even really a villain. You kind of have to look for some of the extra layers with Lysander, and Pokemon fans didn't expect to have to do that, including me. I didn't find some of them until now, in this playthrough where I was intentionally looking for that kind of thing. Similarly, the 4 friends are in some ways genuinely shallow and not super interesting characters, and I had to play with my critical thinking switched on to fully figure out their role in the story, which even then works better for me than it used to, but is not without its lack of substance in some parts. But even then, they aren't exactly stellar characters, and for my third point, I do think that the story of these games had some issues in how it was told. Again, you can see a lot of this with Team Flare. Lysander is an outlier in what looks mostly like just a goofy villain group, and the way that his story plays out can be jarring and doesn't seem to flow quite right in a first playthrough. By writing him as rigidly, uncompromisingly, who he is, to the point where he's making villain speeches before his explicit villain reveal, long before, makes him look like a silly character who should never have been able to get to where he is. The villain reveal twist, if I can call it that, feels kind of absurd when, we all knew for a long time at that point. And it doesn't help that some of the information that best explains what Lysander is about is, again, written down in scattered notes in an optional room that's very easy to miss. They might have buried too many leads there. I don't want to be too critical of fans for not understanding Lysander, because I was right there with them for many years and through multiple playthroughs until I made that extra effort in this playthrough right here. And I do now think that he's a good villain, but the fact that he landed so badly with so many people for so long suggests to me that there really are some serious issues in how his story was told. I'm no storytelling expert, but something definitely went wrong there. Fourth, while Kalos is mostly a pretty and vibrant region, some key parts of it are kind of bland. The gym leaders mostly have some decent personalities, but there isn't much more to them than that. There isn't very much to the Elite Four at all, with the obvious exception of Malva. Diantha is one of the blandest champions in the Pokemon series. The Battle Maison is one of the blandest battle facilities, and a disappointment to players who want to grind that kind of thing, something like a Battle Frontier especially, long after they've put the story behind them. For all that I've praised Lysander, it's fair to say that they kind of dropped the ball on some other key characters and features in these games. And finally, again, there is just the subjective experience of a fan. For a lot of us, these games just didn't arrive at the right time to capture our childhood fantasies. There's nothing to be done about that, and it might just be a matter of time before that part of the discourse changes. Nothing in Pokemon hits quite like your first few games, and just as the legacy of Generation 5 has changed drastically as the kids who grew up on it have, well, grown up, maybe X and Y are due for their moment soon. Like I said earlier, I hope so. Oh, and this generation also suffers from feeling unfinished because there just was never a Pokemon Z to expand on the Kalos region. Kalos suffers for being the only major region so far that has only appeared in one game release. That's what my script says. That's actually not true. Galar and Paldea do as well, but of course they expanded on those with DLC. You know what I mean saying. That sucks for Kalos, and it should finally get better when Legends ZA gives it a long overdue return. So, like I said, I don't think that X and Y are the best games in the series, and as the start of the modern era of Pokemon, I do think that they're a little rough around the edges. They have their flaws, but I still like them, and I think that they were a good first step toward what came after them. They have plenty of charm, as well as those flaws. And much to my surprise, playing through them for content like I did here changed my opinion of them. I like these games more now than I ever did before. So much so that I've written this 17-page script for a video that I didn't even originally plan to make at all. And while I'm still an old fan deep down, and I don't know that I have it in me to bump X and Y up my tier list, I definitely give these games a solid good out of 10. Well worth playing, and if they are your favorites, I think you chose well. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and all that. I want to do another series like this one, and I have multiple ideas, but it's not going to be anytime soon. But I thought this would be just a silly little playthrough, and then it went and turned into an actual passion project over a few months, which I was not ready for, and it's been a fun ride for sure. So, there's more to come eventually, no doubt. But for now, au revoir, happy gaming.